am Pritchett. I'm the author of the book, The Rebirth of Education. The book, Rebirth of Education, has some very fundamental and, I believe, important messages. The first message is that a commitment to universalizing education has been around for a very long time. The Human Rights Declaration at the early onset of the UN committed to a universal education for every child. Now, we're on the verge of actually achieving universal schooling for every child. The expansion of schooling, the number of years that children spend inside a formal building called a school, has expanded astronomically in the world. If you look at the average years of schooling of an adult in the developing world in 1950, it was only 2 years of schooling. So the entire progress of the human race up until 1950 only had the typical adult with very, very little schooling, 2 years. That has gone to 7 years in the developing world. So there has been more progress in expanding schooling in the last 60 years than in the previous 6,000 combined. That is an enormous victory in expanding schooling. And it's a tremendous achievement, an irreversible watershed in human history, essentially. However, why am I talking about a rebirth of education? Because in order to get to the expansion of schooling, we shifted the goalposts from the goalposts for education had always been education defined in terms of what children knew, in terms of the capabilities children acquired, in terms of their adequate preparation to emerge from their schooling experience ready for the adult world they would face. That's education. We presumed that if we drove out the amount of schooling, that we would also drive up the amount of education. It's that premise, unfortunately and tragically, that has proved false. If you want to find in today's world an uneducated child, the tragic truth is you should look in a school. In many countries around the world, children spend 3, 4, 5, 6 years in schooling and emerge fundamentally illiterate, not able to read and write, and certainly not read with the sophistication that will be demanded in the 21st century, and fundamentally innumerate, barely able in some cases to carry out arithmetic operations, and certainly not capable of applying analytical and reasoning skills to the problems, again, that they will face in their lifetimes of the 20th century. And the reason for that is if you think about the relationship between years spent in schooling and education accumulated, what I call the learning profile, the pace at which children learn per year of schooling, is just too slow. And since it's too slow, children arrive at the end of their schooling experience woefully unprepared for the world they will face as adults. So I believe we need a rebirth of education. We now have schooling. We're in the physical and material conditions where we can make possible the reality of universal education, but actually, the shift will be very difficult because what I argue is the systems that brought us success in schooling were geared around the kinds of things that were easy to deliver. It's relatively easy in a large top-down bureaucratic command and control setting to build a school for every village in a country. It takes resources, it takes expertise, but organizationally it's simple. But as we move from the skills that are necessary to build a building, to what it takes to actually impart learning to every child, it's an entirely different form. And so I argue that we need to move from thinking of top-down, or what I call spider-like organizations in which all of the resources are controlled with command and control from the top, to starfish-like schooling systems, in which there's much more autonomy, much more ability of teachers and principals to solve and address the learning issues and learning goals that their parents and children have in the individual school, while at the same time they're supported. The reason I talk about starfish systems is starfish systems are creatures in which there's lots of decentralized autonomy, in which lots of the individual tentacles are actually determining the direction the starfish moves rather than waiting for command and control from some centralized system. But it's not just any starfish system, because starfish systems can also wander around, but a particular kind of starfish systems. I think we need to combine local autonomy with what I call performance pressured. We need to find ways of building in accountability of the schooling system to the citizens, communities, parents, and children the school delivers around adequate information to all and transparency about what in fact the school is delivering and how it's working. So that creates a performance pressure, a culture that learning is important, we're delivering learning. The second thing is we need adequately financed starfish systems. By moving to local autonomy, we don't want to move away from the principle of equalizing opportunities for all. That requires offsetting transfers of funds so that every child, irrespective of the conditions of their parents or their neighborhood, has an adequate opportunity for education through adequate financing of a starfish system. Those systems need to be technically supported. Becoming an excellent teacher just doesn't happen by chance. It happens when teachers are encouraged and supported through through technical support to achieve excellence. They have to have the materials, they have to be working in the right equipment, and they have to have the kind of technical and pedagogical support they need. And starfish systems should be professionally networked. That is, one has to have a diffusion of ideas, so what works well transmits and gets adopted throughout the system through a horizontal diffusion process. So rather than imagining that teachers are going to become teachers simply by being told through some top-down training to be good teachers, teachers form professional reference groups that say, here's what's worked for me in this context, and they can learn for others. So I think the shift from delivering merely on the goal of universal schooling to deliver truly on the goal that we have always had of universal education requires that we shift mentality from merely a schooling to a learning orientation, and that's going to require a shift in the ways in which education systems are organized from a top-down system that can deliver logistics to starfish-like systems that can deliver concern, care for each child, but those starfish systems need to be appropriately managed so that they can be locally autonomous, financially flexible, and adequately financed, technically supported, professionally networked. I think in those kind of conditions, every country in the world can achieve much, much higher levels of learning and create a future that's bright for every child.